join you. I'm glad to be with you.
Thank you so much. Let's just jump right into it. So this week, there was a delay in the allocation of federal funds to the local state governments. Also, for the second month in a row, youth corpers have not been paid. And also, the NNPC has not been able to make regular payments to federal accounts. So in light of all this, can you say that Nigeria is broke?
Well, I'd be careful jumping to the use of certain words to describe phenomena. Clearly, there is a management challenge. I do know for a fact that a number of agencies have had delays in getting funding, even as it went due to public servants. But this is part of a big malaise that goes with poor administration, poor budgeting, and terrible spending patterns that challenge the system. But I would not go as far as to suggest that Nigeria was broke. I think that clearly there are revenue sources that are still flowing fairly predictably, and that the nature of the cycle is such that if there were even gaps in certain payments, it would not be such that the country would be on the verge of being broke. However, it is an important signal of where things are going. It's sort of reminiscent of a period in 1982 when for 2 weeks Nigeria did not sell 1 barrel of oil, and when it was suggested that a crisis was looming, people dismissed it, and then later we dealt with a serious debt crisis during that season. I think that there are signs that have been ominous for some time about the traditions of public expenditure. The big debate in January that was erroneously described as a fuel subsidy protest was essentially a revolt against abuse of public management of resources in Nigeria.
I definitely want to talk about the Occupy Nigeria rallies, but I first want to talk about the debt. How much debt are we talking about in terms of Nigeria?
Well, you know that a couple of years ago, we made what, in my opinion, was a grievous error of judgment in the paying off of Nigeria's external debt. We expended about $12 billion from the windfall that we got from crude oil prices in the early days of return to civilian rule between 1999 and 2002. In debt that we already had Naples terms agreements with international financial institutions, and we could have had a significant portion written off because there were so many questionable accounting issues around those debts anyway. And besides, if you make a bad loan, it is in the nature of business that you take responsibility at some point and move on. And many of these international financial institutions are more or less taking responsibility for their errors of judgment.
And speaking of loans, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, her claim to fame was that she helped to negotiate a reduction in Nigeria's loans from $30 billion to about $12 billion. That's
what I'm referring to.
Exactly. So how can she justify now asking for the National Assembly to approve a $7.9 billion loan?
Well, loans are not a problem of their own. It's part of how you build a business, you build a nation, that you look at what you want to apply a loan to, and if that can effectively amortize the loan and create an upside, in principle, there should be nothing wrong with such a loan. The United States of America was built on loans from Europe, the railroads in America. And actually, many of these loans were not paid off ultimately.
Right.
But the important thing is that there has to be a certain responsibility in the way that you approach these loans. Nigeria's first debt crisis came out of the fact that with the oil boom, the first oil boom in the early 70s, Wall Street banks were awash with petrodollars, and they were looking at how to recycle these petrodollars. And they said to countries like Nigeria, you are underborrowed, and it shows that you are not pulling your weight if you are so badly underborrowed. And so we rushed and borrowed, and we did not apply them to productive uses that would regenerate our economy, amortize the commitment, and help us go in.
Right.
They played games, the banks in New York, with Nigerian public officials, and many of these went bad.
So you're saying
in the
that
natural course, they should be written off, but we didn't manage it well. And a couple of years ago, under our Obasanjo administration, when we had this windfall, we took this chunk of money we could have used to build infrastructure in Nigeria. I'm here in China, I'm in Shanghai going through fascinating infrastructure that was built in a couple of years because they applied themselves. But we failed to do that in our own situation, and we took this bulk of money that we earned and gave it away to people who are literally written it off. I spoke up at the time, but didn't want to seem like I was too disagreeable, so I didn't persist on my comments about how wrong-headed that decision was. I know that President Obasanjo himself came to realize it was a mistake, but we celebrated the process and thought it was a success for Nigeria, and now we're back to square one.
So you're saying that it's okay for the federal government to borrow about $7.9 billion in loans.
I'm not saying it's okay.
If they actually do something with it, if it's held accountable.
If they do something with it that creates jobs for Nigerians, because that is desperately needed.
Right.
If they do something with it that can regenerate itself as it creates jobs, I don't mind if you borrow the 100 billion. But right now, I don't see a game plan.
Right.
And I will not support borrowing in the current circumstance.
Well, the government is saying that it will use these funds for special critical projects to be targeted toward the 2012-2014 external borrowing plan. So can you give us any of the key points? From what I understand, under this plan, the government will be able to borrow $2.64 billion every year.
To do exactly what?
Right.
That creates how many jobs? That regenerates what economic sector? That drives what value chain for global dominance for Nigeria in that area? I don't see that game plan. I don't see it quite clearly.
Do you know any of the points in this plan, the external borrowing plan?
Well, I have been so unhappy with the general thrust of public policy that assumes that the Nigerian people cannot enter a public debate on our strategy. And that's really what is on ground here. There are very few people who have something in their head who they have not sold to the Nigerian people. And if Nigerian people don't have buy-in, they can't put in the kind of work that will make you realize any plan. So I personally don't even see the point of beginning to discuss this.
Right. Okay. Well, then let's talk about oil. The federal government said that it's losing about $7 billion every single day to crude oil theft, and that's about a rate of 180,000 barrels a day. So my question to you is, why is the federal government just now realizing that billions are being lost to crude oil theft? Is this legitimate?
Well, I think the amounts are absurd. No, we couldn't be losing that much money. But we are losing money to crude oil theft, yes. But this has been going on for some time. Part of it is in rackets run by powerful people in Nigeria over the years. It got to a point where even the Colombian mafia was said to be involved. and all of these. Then the militancy situation in the Niger Delta, compounded things. It seemed to come under some control, and nobody talked about it. And then now the issues come in, and the volume. Yes, we're losing significant monies to crude oil theft.
Right.
But the problem is what security measures are we applying, and those involved in security somehow are compromised in the process. Who really is the thief?
Mm-hmm.
So numbers, you can throw out, but the real question is, first of all, are those numbers accurate? Secondly, who's responsible for it? And that's no reason to go and borrow money from somewhere anyway.
So in view of the fuel subsidy scam, did Occupy Nigeria achieve anything?
Indeed. Do you think that all this information that's before us would have come out if you didn't have that? Oh, that is the ultimate triumph for the people, that we now know the detail of the abuse. I think that if we didn't have people turning out and occupying, you would never have heard how bad it happens to be. A few of us knew it was bad, very bad, but we did not realize how bad it was. I mean, I was on a live television broadcast during the course of that season, and I was trying to just use basic information to analyze the data. And enough people who I thought had knowledge and authority in Nigeria were shocked by the points I made, that they began to call up. And the Speaker of the Federal House of Assembly called me that afternoon to say, look, can you help us think through this, because we don't even know how far gone things are. And part of that conversation resulted in the emergency session of the of the Federal House of Representatives that led to the probe that was chaired by Farouk Lawan, and that has opened up this unbelievable Pandora's box about the level of abuse of the oil business.
Right. Well, you were very active in Occupy Nigeria, Professor. So do you think that Nigerians need to go back on the streets and mass rallies to demand change?
I believe that the future of Nigeria lies in building institutions, and institutions will not drop from the sky. They will drop from an activist citizenry that uses whatever appropriate means, whether it is occupying or using the courts. I think we should use the courts. I have deliberately put myself in way of being able to have local stand-by on a number of issues that I hope we will litigate for a long time in Nigeria. We're going to occupy the courts really with these issues. Those who can occupy the streets should do it if it's fundamental, and and the costs don't exceed what can be achieved.
Right.
Surely the challenge of progress in Nigeria lies in how civil society can organize itself, because we, the political class, have failed the Nigerian people. Clearly, I have repeated that our democracy seems to have been reduced to a government of politicians, for politicians, by politicians. The Nigerian people, I mean, even the scandal of how much people in public office draw from the system, both legally and illegally, is enough for an enlightened citizenry to stop the country from functioning.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the civil society. That leads me to my final question, Professor. So what can the average Nigerian do to forge ahead and continue despite the government's financial woes and the mismanagement of funds? I mean, how can you gauge how much the mismanagement is affecting the average Nigerian, the life of the average Nigerian?
Oh, I try to give a little example from my home state of Delta. When the erstwhile governor of my state was sent to jail in London,
right.
Mr. Ibori was said to have a $250 million US or something in the UK. That's just the UK. And I said, if you took just his hometown alone and applied just 10 million US dollars, you would literally bring maternal mortality at childbirth to zilch. You know, if you took so much from that money, you know, the state has no infrastructure that you can speak to.
Right.
And just applying a quarter of what he has in the UK alone would transform that state. I challenge journalists. I was speaking at a media conference
right.
in Port Harcourt a few weeks ago. I challenge journalists. And I said, part of the problem of Nigeria is the media, the failure of the Nigerian media. If a governor travels to the airport in a motorcade, he should be able to report his journey to the airport in terms of how much the cost of that motorcade means in terms of infant mortality at childbirth. And, you know, that level of accountability would bring us to some, seriousness. Because right now there's no accountability.
Right.
And people are getting away with murder.
Well, on that note, Professor, I want to thank you so much for joining us on Sahara TV. I really appreciate your insights. All right, well, thank you so much. That was Professor Utomi joining us via Skype from Shanghai, China. He is a political economist and also a two-time presidential candidate of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned on Sahara TV.